Dignity doesn't cost much, but it means everything when you've got nothing left. In a frontier town where hearts had turned to stone, one act of kindness would change two lonely lives forever. 62-year-old mountain man Caleb Ward rode down from the high country to trade furs before winter. In the dusty town square, he found an estate auction where a grieving widow stood silent, while the auctioneer mocked her worth. When they sneered she was worthless than a mule, Caleb didn't laugh. He stepped forward and offered everything he owned, not to buy a person, but to give her freedom and dignity. What happens when two people who've lost everything discover they still have something to give? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain peaks had begun their transformation from summer green to autumn gold when Caleb Ward started his descent from the high country. At 62 years old, his body still moved with the economy of a man who'd spent most of his life in places where wasted motion could mean death. The pack mule behind him carried 6 months of work, prime beaver pelts, marten furs soft as prayer, and 2 wolf hides so perfect they'd fetch enough coin to keep him through another winter. 30 years he'd lived up there in the thin air where eagles nested and storms came without warning. 30 years since he'd buried his wife Sarah and their daughter Emily in graves he'd dug with his own hands while his heart turned to stone. The fever had taken them both in the same cruel week while he'd been trapping 2 valleys north, and when he'd come home to silence, something in him had broken so completely that he'd never bothered trying to fix it. He made this journey once a year, always in autumn, before the first heavy snows closed the passes. Down to Copper Ridge to trade his furs, stock up on flour and salt and coffee, maybe a new knife if the old one had finally given up. Then back to his cabin where the silence was clean and the solitude didn't ask questions he couldn't answer. The trail wound through the stands of aspen that shimmered gold in the afternoon light. Caleb had walked this path so many times he could do it blind. Every switchback and stream crossing mapped in his muscles. The mule, a stolid gray creature named Buck, followed without complaint. They understood each other, he and Buck. Both preferred their own company and didn't see the need for unnecessary conversation. By late afternoon of the second day, the town came into view below, a scatter of weathered buildings along a single main street, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys. Copper Ridge had grown some since his last visit. A new building at the north end looked like maybe a second saloon or a boarding house. The church steeple still stood tallest, white paint peeling in the mountain sun. The trading post sat at the edge of town, a low building of rough-hewn logs with a porch that sagged in the middle. Old Henrik ran it, had run it for as long as Caleb could remember. Henrik was one of the few people in town who knew Caleb's story, who'd known Sarah back when she was alive and laughing. They didn't talk about it. Henrik wasn't the type to pry, but there was an understanding between them. The bell above the door jangled as Caleb pushed inside. The familiar smell hits him, leather and tobacco, coffee beans and lamp oil, the sweet rot scent of tomatoes stored too long. Henrik looked up from his ledger, his weathered face creasing into something that might have been a smile on a more expressive man. Caleb, right on time, as always. Henrik? Caleb began unloading pelts onto the counter. Brought you some good ones this year. Henrik's hands, gnarled with arthritis, but still knowing, moved over the furs with practiced assessment. He held a beaver pelt to the light, examined the marten with a jeweler's attention, nodded slowly at the wolf hides. Fine work. Very fine. He pulled out his cash box. You'll want the usual supplies, I expect? And maybe some tobacco if the prize isn't robbery. For you, I'll make it reasonable thievery instead. Henrik's version of humor. He began tallying numbers in his ledger. You staying in town tonight? Thought I might. Get an early start back tomorrow. Henrik's pencil paused. Might want to stay through tomorrow. There's an estate auction in the square. Thomas Hale's place. The name meant nothing to Caleb. Don't know him. Farmer, about 10 miles west, worked himself near to death trying to make that land produce. Heart gave out 3 weeks back, right in his own field. Henrik kept his eyes on his ledger. Left a widow. No children, no family. Bank selling everything to cover debts. Caleb understood the unspoken message. This was the frontier. Men died. Widows were left with nothing. It was tragic and it was common, and there wasn't much anyone could do about it except watch and feel relieved it hadn't happened to them. She have somewhere to go? Caleb found himself asking. Henrik shrugged. That's her problem to solve. Martha's her name. Martha Hale. Decent woman, from what I hear. Quiet. Kept to herself mostly. But decent don't play debts. The transaction completed, Caleb took his supplies and his coin, less than he'd hoped for the furs, more than he'd feared. Enough to see him through winter with a little left over. He secured everything in Buck's packs and walked the mule to the livery stable, paid for a night's board and feed. The boarding house had a room available, small and spare, with a bed that sagged and a window that looked out on the street. Caleb paid for 1 night, set his rifle in the corner, and washed his face in the basin. The mirror on the wall showed him what he already knew. A man weathered down to essentials, gray beard, eyes that had seen too much and stopped being surprised by any of it. He ate supper at the saloon, a plate of stew that was mostly potatoes with some meat that might have been beef. The other men in the room talked around him, their conversations washing over like creek water over stones. He caught fragments: drought to the south, Indian troubles to the east, railroad surveyors asking questions about land rights. And talk of tomorrow's auction. Virgil Blackwood was handling it, which meant it would be a spectacle. Blackwood had a reputation for squeezing every cent from an estate sale, legal or otherwise. Some said he enjoyed it a little too much. The power of standing up there with his gavel, deciding what a man's life was worth. Caleb finished his meal and walked back to the boarding house. The evening air was cold, sharp, with the promise of winter. Stars were coming out, brilliant in the mountain darkness. Up in his cabin, the stars looked close enough to touch. Down here, they seemed farther away. He lay in his unfamiliar bed and listened to the sounds of the town settling for the night. Somewhere a dog barked, a door slammed, voices rose and fell in argument or conversation. He couldn't tell which. He thought about Henrik's words. A widow with nowhere to go. It wasn't his concern. He'd learned long ago that the only way to survive grief was to stop letting other people's suffering touch you. But sleep was slow in coming. He kept seeing Sarah's face the way it had looked that last morning before he left for his trapping run. She'd kissed him goodbye, told him to be careful, promised Emily would have a new dress sewn by the time he returned. He'd gone 6 weeks. When he came back, the cabin was empty, except for the Reverend and the 2 fresh graves on the hillside. He'd never sewn anything again, never made promises, never let anyone close enough to lose. Morning came with pale light through the thin curtains. Caleb dressed, collected his things, paid his bill. He'd planned to leave immediately, get back on the trail while the day was young, but his feet carried him toward the town square instead. A crowd had already gathered. The sale was set to begin at 9 o'clock, and people had come from farms and homesteads all around. Some were here to buy, most just to watch. Entertainment was scarce on the frontier. Other people's misfortune would do as well as anything. Thomas Hale's possessions were laid out on rough tables: tools and furniture, kitchen implements, a plow that had seen better days, 3 chickens in a cage, a milk cow tied to a post. And standing to one side, very still, very straight, was a woman in a black dress. Martha Hale. She had to be. Mid-50s maybe, with gray streaking her dark hair. Her face was composed, but Caleb could see the cost of that composure in the tightness around her eyes, the way her hands gripped each other at her waist. She wore a simple gold ring on her left hand. Her dress was mended in several places, carefully done. Virgil Blackwood stood on a wooden platform, gavel in hand, looking pleased with the turnout. He was a big man gone to fat, his vest straining across his belly, his voice carrying across the square with practiced ease. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this lawful sale of the estate of Thomas Hale, deceased. He made it sound like a celebration. All proceeds will go towards settling the deceased's outstanding debts to various creditors, principal among them the Copper Ridge Bank and Trust. A man in a fine suit stood near the front. That would be Crowley, the banker. Caleb had never met him, but you could spot a banker anywhere. They all had the same look, like they were calculating interest rates while they ate breakfast. The auction began. The furniture went first, piece by piece. A table brought $3. Chairs went for 50 cents each. The tools sold to various farmers who needed them or thought they might. The cow fetched a decent price from a man with several children who needed the milk. The chickens went for next to nothing. Through it all, Martha Hale stood motionless, watching her life be dismantled and sold to strangers. Caleb found himself unable to look away from her face. There was something in her expression that he recognized. The look of someone who'd already lost everything that mattered and was just waiting for the formalities to be done. Blackwood's voice droned on. The crowd pressed closer, and Caleb felt something stirring in his chest that he'd thought was long dead. Not quite anger, not quite sorrow. Something that made his hands clench and his jaw tighten. He told himself to leave. This wasn't his business. He'd done his trading, got his supplies, the trail was waiting. Buck was rested and ready. There was no reason to stay. But his feet didn't move, and as Blackwood raised his gavel for the next lot, Caleb knew with sudden certainty that he was about to see something he wouldn't be able to forget, something that would make leaving impossible. The autumn sun climbed higher. The crowd murmured and jostled. Martha Hale stood alone in her careful dignity, waiting for whatever came next. And Caleb Ward, who'd spent 30 years avoiding exactly this kind of moment, found himself rooted to the spot, unable to turn away. The last of the household items sold for pennies: a worn quilt, a set of tin plates, a lamp with a cracked chimney. Blackwood consulted his ledger, running his thick finger down the columns. The crowd had begun to thin. People had what they came for and were drifting away to their own concerns. "Well now," Blackwood's voice rang out, stopping the exodus, "we come to the final matter of this estate." He made a show of consulting his papers. "According to my calculations, the total proceeds from this sale amount to $42.30. The outstanding debts, however, total $67.15. A murmur ran through the remaining crowd. Crowley the banker stepped forward, his face arranged in what was probably meant to be sympathetic concern, but looked more like satisfaction. "A shortfall of nearly $25, Crowley said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Most unfortunate indeed." Martha Hale's face had gone very pale, but she didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there with her hands clasped, her wedding ring catching the sunlight. Blackwood cleared his throat. "Now, as you all know, there are provisions in territorial law for cases such as this. When an estate cannot satisfy its debts through the sale of property, alternative arrangements must be made." He paused for effect, enjoying the attention. "The widow Martha Hale, having no independent means, may enter into a labor contract to satisfy the remaining debt. The terms would be reasonable. Room and board provided in exchange for domestic work until such time as the debt is considered paid." It was a polite way of saying what everyone knew. Martha would be sold, not officially, of course, not in those words, but she'd be bound to whoever paid her debt, working without wages until they decided she'd earned her freedom. It could be months, could be years. Some women never got free. "Do I have any interested parties?" Blackwood scanned the crowd. An old farmer raised his hand. "I could use help with my wife. She's been poorly. I'll offer $10 toward the debt." $10, Blackwood repeated. "Anyone willing to go higher?" A rancher from the North Valley spoke up. 15. I need a cook for my hands." The bidding crept upward. $16, 18, 20. Each bid was a reduction of Martha's worth, a calculation of how little a woman's labor and dignity were valued. Caleb watched her face. She was holding herself together through sheer will, but he could see the cracks forming. At $22, the bidding stalled. The rancher shook his head, not willing to go higher. Blackwood raised his gavel. $22 once. Wait! A voice from the side, a thin man in dusty clothes. I'll give $23, but I want it clear. She'll be working my claim out past Willow Creek. Lonely country out there. She'll need to understand there's certain expectations that come with... The man didn't finish. His meaning was clear enough. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Martha's face lost what little color it had left. Blackwood frowned. Even he seemed to recognize this had crossed a line. But before he could speak, Crowley stepped forward again. I'm afraid that won't be acceptable, the banker said smoothly. Mrs. Hale's labor contract must be appropriate and above reproach. We're not savages here. Then what do you suggest? Blackwood asked, clearly relieved to have the decision taken from him. Crowley's smile was thin and calculating. The bank holds the primary debt. I propose Mrs. Hale enters service at my household. My wife needs assistance with domestic affairs. $25 would clear the remaining debt entirely. Mrs. Hale would have respectable employment and a roof over her head. It's the most sensible solution. The most profitable solution, Caleb thought. Crowley would get years of unpaid labor from a woman who'd have no choice but to be grateful for it. And if she happened to know anything about her late husband's land dealings, well, that would be convenient for a banker with his eye on property. Martha was staring at the ground now. Her shoulders had begun to shake slightly. She was breaking right there in front of everyone. Blackwood raised his gavel. Hearing no other offers, I'll accept Mr. Crowley's bid of... How much? The words were out of Caleb's mouth before he'd fully decided to speak. The crowd turned to look at him. Blackwood squinted, trying to place this stranger with the weathered face and mountain clothes. I beg your pardon, Blackwood said. Caleb stepped forward, his heart hammering in a way it hadn't in 30 years. How much to clear all the debts? Total amount. Blackwood consulted his papers again. $67.15. As I stated, I'll pay it. Silence fell over the square. Even the wind seemed to pause. Crowley's face went dark with anger. Blackwood looked confused. You'll what? Pay the debts. All of them. She goes free. No contracts. No obligations. Caleb's voice was steady despite the wildness of what he was doing. That's how it works, isn't it? Debts paid, persons free. Blackwood recovered his composure. Well, yes, technically, but that's a considerable sum for a... He looked Caleb up and down, taking in the worn clothes, the mountain man's rough appearance. For anyone to simply give away. Who said anything about giving? Caleb pulled out his coin purse. The weight of it, 6 months of hard work, his entire winter stake, sat heavy in his palm. He began counting onto the platform. That's $40 in coin. The crowd pressed closer, watching. Crowley moved forward, his face tight with barely controlled rage. Now see here... Caleb ignored him. I got prime beaver pelts still at Henrik's trading post, worth $15 at least. He'll verify it. He unbuckled his belt, pulled off his knife sheath. This here's a genuine Bowie knife, steel from Sheffield, worth $5 easy. He set it on the platform with a solid thunk. Blackwood was staring at the growing pile. This is highly irregular. My pack mule, Caleb continued. His voice had taken on a quality he hardly recognized. Determined, almost fierce. Buck, good strong animal, never balks, knows the mountain trails, worth $10 if he's worth a penny. He pulled his spare rifle from across his back. And this, Winchester rifle, hardly used, that's another $12 at least. He stood there, having just offered up everything he owned. His winter supplies would have to be bought on credit now. He'd be going back to his cabin with nothing but the clothes on his back and whatever game he could shoot with his other rifle. If he caught sick, if the winter was hard, if anything went wrong, he'd have no cushion, no backup. He'd just handed over his survival for a woman whose name he'd learned that morning. Martha was staring at him. Her eyes were wide, shocked, uncomprehending. The wedding ring on her finger caught the light again, and for just a moment, Caleb saw Sarah's face overlaying Martha's. Saw the look Sarah had worn when she was frightened and trying not to show it. Blackwood was adding numbers, his lips moving. Finally, he looked up. The items you've listed total approximately $82, more than sufficient to clear all debts with a small overage. Then we have a deal, Caleb's voice was firm. "This is absurd," Crowley exploded. "You can't just ride into town and—" "Can't I?" Caleb turned to face the banker. "Money's money, isn't it? Or does it only count when it comes from the right sort of person?" Judge Harlan, who'd been watching from the edge of the crowd, stepped forward. He was an older man, respected, one of the few people in the territory who actually knew territorial law. "The man's right, Crowley. If the debts are paid in full, the widow is free of obligation. That's the law, plain and simple." Crowley's face had gone red. "This is conspiracy, collusion." "This is commerce," the judge said mildly. "Unless you want to argue that Mrs. Hale shouldn't be allowed to have her debts cleared?" The banker opened his mouth, then closed it. He'd been outmaneuvered, and he knew it. Making a scene now would only make him look petty. He turned and stalked away, his fine coat swirling behind him. Blackwood brought his gavel down with a sharp crack. "Debts paid in full. Martha Hale is free of all obligations. This sale is concluded." The crowd began to disperse, buzzing with gossip. This would be talked about for months. The mountain man who came down and bought a widow's freedom with everything he owned. Some would call it noble. Others would call it foolish. Most would call it both. Caleb turned to Martha. She was still standing in the same spot, her face a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that might have been the beginning of tears. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you're free now. Debts are cleared. You can go where you please." She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "Why?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why would you do that?" Caleb didn't have a good answer. He barely understood it himself. All he knew was that he'd seen a woman standing alone with nothing but her dignity left, and something in him had refused to watch that last thing be taken from her. "Seemed like the right thing to do," he finally said. It was inadequate, but it was honest. Martha looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were the color of good earth after rain. "I don't even know your name." "Caleb Ward." "Martha Hale." She held out her hand. He shook it. Her grip was stronger than he expected. "Thank you, Mr. Ward. I'll find a way to repay you somehow." "No need. Like I said, you're free. No debts, no obligations." He glanced around the emptying square. "You got somewhere to go? Family?" Her face closed down slightly. No family. She looked at the empty tables where her life had been sorted and sold. "I suppose I'll figure something out." Caleb knew he should walk away now. He'd done what some incomprehensible impulse had driven him to do. She was free. His conscience, whatever part of it had suddenly woken after 30 years, should be satisfied. But looking at her standing there in her mended black dress, trying so hard to be brave, he couldn't do it. Couldn't just leave her in the street with nowhere to go and winter coming on. "I got a cabin," he heard himself say, "up in the mountains. It's not much, but it's got 2 rooms. You could stay through winter if you need, just until you figure out what's next." She studied his face, looking for the catch, the hidden price. He understood that. He'd expect the same in her position. "Why would you offer that?" she asked carefully. "Because winter's no time to be figuring out where to sleep," he said. "And because no one should have to stand in a town square and watch strangers decide what they're worth." Something in her expression shifted. Not quite trust, but maybe the beginning of it. "One winter?" "One winter. Come spring, you can decide what you want to do." Martha looked at the town, at the people who'd watched her humiliation like it was entertainment. Then she looked back at Caleb, this stranger who'd just given up everything for reasons he couldn't even explain. "All right," she said quietly. "One winter." The silence between them stretched awkward and uncertain as the square emptied. Martha stood with her hands clasped, looking at everything except Caleb. He understood. She'd just agreed to go into the wilderness with a stranger. Of course she was having second thoughts. "I should gather my things," she said finally, "what I have left. I'll come with you, help carry." They walked through town together, neither speaking. People stared from windows and doorways. The gossip was already spreading like fire through dry grass. Caleb could feel the weight of their judgment, their curiosity, their assumptions. Let them think what they wanted. He'd stopped caring about other people's opinions 3 decades ago. Martha's belongings fit in a single trunk and 2 cloth bags. Her entire life reduced to what could be carried on a pack horse. Clothes mostly, all of them mended and remended. A few books, Shakespeare, Dickens, the Bible. Kitchen items she'd salvaged from the sale. and wrapped carefully in an old shawl, a pocket watch that no longer worked. She saw him looking at it. It was Thomas's, his father's before that. The auctioneer said it wasn't worth fixing. Her fingers traced the scratched silver case. I wind it every night anyway. Habit, I suppose. Caleb understood about habits that made no sense, but you kept doing anyway. He still set out 2 cups for coffee every morning before remembering there was only him. Judge Harlan caught them as they were loading Martha's trunk onto Buck. The old man's face was kind but concerned. Mrs. Hale, I need to verify something for the record. You're going with Mr. Ward of your own free will? No coercion? Yes, Judge. My own choice. And you, Ward, you understand the position this puts you both in? People will talk. Let them talk, Caleb said. The judge nodded slowly. I suppose they will regardless. He pulled out a document. Just to make everything legal and clear, I'm noting in the territorial records that all debts against the Hale estate have been satisfied in full. Martha Hale is free of all financial obligation. She is under no contract or bond of any kind. He handed the paper to Martha. Keep this safe, in case anyone questions your status. Thank you, Judge. Harlan turned to Caleb, lowering his voice. You're sure about this? Taking a woman you don't know into the high country? No, Caleb answered honestly, but I'm doing it anyway. Fair enough. The judge tipped his hat. You need anything, you send word. Winter can be hard up there. Old Henrik appeared as they were about to leave, carrying a burlap sack. Supplies, he said gruffly, handing it to Caleb. Flour, salt, coffee. Consider it credit against next year's furs. Henrik, I can't. You can and you will. What you did today, the old man's voice roughened. Sarah would have been proud. Caleb's throat tightened. He took the sack without further argument. Thank you. Henrik nodded to Martha. You're getting a good man, even if he is stubborn as that mule of his. I'm not getting a man, Martha said firmly. I'm accepting shelter through winter. There's a difference. Course there is. Henrik's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. My mistake. Sheriff Clayton was their last interruption. He pulled Caleb aside while Martha arranged her bags. Listen, the sheriff said quietly. Crowley's not the type to let something like this go. He wanted that woman working in his house for his own reasons, and he's got a long memory for people who cross him. I'll keep that in mind. Do more than keep it in mind. Watch your back and hers. Clayton glanced at Martha. She seems like decent folk. Doesn't deserve more trouble. None of us deserve what we get, Caleb said, but we deal with it. The sheriff studied him. You really live up there alone all year? Have for 30 years. That's a long time to be by yourself. It is. Clayton didn't press further. He just nodded and walked away, his hand resting on his gun belt like he expected trouble to show up any minute. Maybe he was right. As they were finally preparing to leave, Reverend Matthews came bustling over, his round face flushed with exertion and excitement. Mr. Ward, Mrs. Hale, wonderful news. I've spoken with the church council and we'd be honored to perform a marriage ceremony. Right now, if you'd like. No charge, of course. It would sanctify the arrangement and prevent any unseemly talk. No. Caleb's voice was flat. But surely you understand the impropriety of an unmarried woman traveling alone with a man. She's not alone. She's free. Big difference. Martha stepped forward, her voice steady. Reverend Matthews, I appreciate your concern, but Mr. Ward has been perfectly clear. He's offering shelter, not marriage. I'm accepting shelter, not a husband. If people want to gossip, that's their burden to carry, not ours. The Reverend sputtered, but propriety went out the window when they tried to sell me like livestock, Martha said. There was steel beneath her quiet voice. I've got bigger concerns than what people think is proper. She turned away from him and climbed onto Buck's back. Caleb had given her the mule to ride while he walked. The Reverend stood there looking flustered and vaguely offended. Let's go, Martha said to Caleb. They left Copper Ridge behind as the sun reached its peak. The trail climbed steadily from the start, winding through foothills that would become mountains. Caleb set an easy pace, mindful that Martha wasn't used to this kind of travel. She sat the mule well enough, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she gripped the reins too tight. They didn't speak for the first hour. The trail was too narrow in places to walk side by side, and besides, neither of them seemed to know what to say. What do you talk about with a stranger you've just committed to spending a winter with? The afternoon shadows were lengthening when Caleb called for a rest. There was a clearing beside a creek, flat ground and water for the animals. Martha dismounted slowly, stiff from riding. "We'll camp here tonight," Caleb said. "Make the line shack by tomorrow evening if we keep good pace." "Line shack?" "Halfway shelter. Nothing fancy, but it's got a roof and a stove." Martha walked to the creek and splashed water on her face. When she straightened, Caleb saw tears mixed with the creek water. She wiped them away quickly, trying to hide it. "Sorry," she said. "It's just, everything's happening so fast." "Take your time, I'll get the fire started." She nodded and moved away, seeking privacy. Caleb busied himself with camp, gathering wood, clearing a fire pit, unpacking the bedrolls. He'd done this 1,000 times alone. Having someone else here felt strange, like he'd forgotten how to move through space when someone else occupied it too. When Martha returned, her face was composed again. She knelt beside the fire pit. "Let me help." "Don't need to." "I know I don't need to. I want to." Her voice was firm. "If I'm staying in your cabin for 6 months, I'm not going to sit idle. I'll carry my weight." Caleb nodded. "Fair enough. Can you handle the coffee pot?" "I can handle more than that." They worked together in silence, building the fire, heating water, preparing a simple meal of jerky and hardtack from Caleb's supplies. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky orange and purple. The temperature dropped fast, the way it always did in the high country. After they'd eaten, sitting on opposite sides of the fire, Martha finally spoke. "Why did you really do it? Buy my freedom?" Caleb poked at the fire with a stick. He'd known this question was coming, had been trying to find an answer that made sense. "I had a wife once," he said slowly. "Sarah. She died 30 years back, along with our daughter. Fever took them while I was away. When I came back..." He stopped, cleared his throat. "I was angry, at God, at myself, at the world, decided I was done with people, done caring, went up into the mountains and stayed there." Martha waited, not pushing. "Today in that square," Caleb continued, "when I saw you standing there and that man made his joke about you being worth less than a mule, I saw Sarah's face, saw what she'd have looked like if she'd been the one standing there helpless while people laughed." He looked up, met Martha's eyes across the fire. "Couldn't walk away from that. Something wouldn't let me." Martha's eyes were wet again, but she didn't look away. "Your wife was lucky to have you." "She died while I was gone," Caleb said. "Lucky isn't the word I'd use." "You came back, that's what matters." Martha's voice was soft but certain. "Thomas died in our field. I found him lying face down in the dirt. All those years of working himself to exhaustion, and I couldn't do a thing to help him." She touched the pocket watch through her dress. "We don't get to choose when we lose people, but we do get to choose what we do after." They sat in silence as the fire burned down to coals. The night sounds of the forest rose around them, wind in the pines, a distant owl, the creek's constant murmur. Two people who'd lost everything, sitting across from each other in the wilderness, trying to figure out what came next. "One winter," Martha said finally. "One winter," Caleb agreed. It felt like a promise, though neither of them could have said what exactly they were promising. Morning came cold and clear, frost silvering the grass around their camp. Caleb was already up when Martha woke, the fire rebuilt, coffee boiling in the pot. She sat up in her bedroll, disoriented for a moment, then remembering where she was and why. "Coffee's ready," Caleb said, not looking at her directly, giving her space to compose herself. They ate a quick breakfast, more hardtack, some dried apples from Henrik's supplies. The mule and Caleb's saddle horse were grazing nearby, their breath making clouds in the cold air. The trail ahead would be steeper today, climbing into real mountain country. "How far?" Martha asked as they packed up camp. "To the line shack? Maybe 20 miles. We'll get there before dark if the weather holds." She nodded and climbed back onto Buck. Her movements were stiffer this morning, muscles protesting yesterday's riding. Caleb noticed, but didn't comment. She'd either toughen up or she wouldn't. No point making a fuss about it. The trail climbed steadily through pine forests that grew thicker and darker as they ascended. The air had a different quality up here, thinner, cleaner, sharp with the smell of resin and approaching winter. They crossed streams running cold and fast with snowmelt from higher elevations. Twice they had to dismount and lead the animals across rock slides that had partially blocked the path. Around midday, snow began to fall. Light at first, just a dusting that melted on contact. Then heavier, thick flakes that stuck to their clothes and the horses' manes. "Is this normal?" Martha asked. Her face was red with cold, her voice tight. "For this elevation this time of year? Yeah, it's early yet. Won't stick long. But winter's coming fast this year. I can feel it." Martha pulled her shawl tighter. "What happens if we get snowed in up at your cabin?" "We wait. Sometimes the pass is closed for weeks at a time. Why I do my trading in fall, stock up on what I need." "And you live like that? Alone for months on end, no way down?" "Been doing it for 30 years. She fell silent, and Caleb wondered what she was thinking. Probably second-guessing her decision to come with him. Probably right to do so. What did she really know about him? Nothing except that he'd made one impulsive gesture in a town square. That didn't make him trustworthy, didn't make him safe. But she kept riding, kept following the trail higher into mountains that probably looked like the end of the world to her. By mid-afternoon, the snow had stopped and the sun broke through, making everything glitter. The vista opened up ahead, peaks stretching in every direction, some already white with permanent snow. It was beautiful in a way that could break your heart, if you let it. "Thomas and I talked about going to California once," Martha said suddenly. "Start fresh somewhere warm, where the growing season was longer. He said after one more good harvest, we'd have enough saved." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. There was never one more good harvest. There was always just one more debt, one more thing going wrong. "Hard country," Caleb said, "breaks most people eventually." "But not you." "It broke me too, just in a different way." They rode on. Caleb found himself telling her things he hadn't spoken aloud in years, about Sarah's laugh, how Emily used to follow him everywhere calling him Papa, the way the cabin had felt after they were gone, like all the air had been sucked out of it. Martha listened without interrupting, without offering platitudes that would have meant nothing. In turn, she told him about Thomas, about their courtship, how he'd been so earnest and hard-working, how they'd both wanted children, but it never happened. 3 pregnancies that ended before they began. How she'd learned to push down that grief and focus on keeping the farm running, keeping Thomas's spirits up, keeping herself from breaking apart. "I used to resent him sometimes," she admitted quietly, "for working so hard, for never stopping, for choosing the land over me." She wiped her eyes. "Then he died and I'd have given anything to have him back, even if he spent every waking hour in those fields." "Grief's like that," Caleb said. "Makes you bargain with ghosts." "Do you still do it? Bargain with yours?" He thought about it. "Less than I used to. Time doesn't heal it exactly, just makes it different. Like an old wound that aches when the weather changes but doesn't lay you out anymore." The line shack came into view as the sun was touching the western peaks. It was tiny, barely more than a lean-to with walls, but it looked like a palace after a day of hard riding. Caleb helped Martha down from the mule. She practically fell into his arms, her legs unable to hold her. "Sorry," she gasped. It's all right. First time's always the hardest." He steadied her until her legs remembered how to work. "Get inside. I'll tend the animals and start a fire." The shack had a small stove, a platform for sleeping, and nothing else. But it was dry, and once Caleb got the fire going, it warmed up fast. Martha sank onto the sleeping platform with a groan. "I don't think I can move." "You will tomorrow. Might not want to, but you will." He heated water and made a thin stew from dried meat and vegetables. They ate sitting on the platform, shoulders almost touching in the small space. The intimacy of it should have been awkward, but somehow it wasn't. Maybe they were both too tired for awkwardness. "Tell me about the cabin," Martha said. "What's it like?" Caleb described it as best he could, one main room with a fireplace and kitchen area, his room off to one side, a second room that had been meant for Emily when she got older. The porch where he sat on summer evenings, the view of the valley below, 3 peaks rising above. the spring that never ran dry just 100 yards from the door. "It sounds peaceful," Martha said. "It is. Some days too peaceful, like the silence is trying to swallow you whole. I never had much silence on the farm. Always something needing done, some noise in the yard. I used to dream about quiet." She pulled the blanket around her shoulders. "Be careful what you wish for, I suppose." Night fell quickly at this altitude. Through the small window, stars emerged so bright and close they looked like you could reach up and touch them. Martha stood at the window staring up at them. "I'd forgotten how many stars there are," she said softly. "In town, you only see a handful. But here they remember they're infinite." Caleb joined her at the window. "That's what I liked about the mountains. They remind you how small you are, how your problems don't matter much in the grand scheme." "Does that help, feeling small?" "Sometimes, when the problems feel too big to carry." Martha turned to look at him in the dim firelight. "I'm glad you were in that town square." "So am I, though I'm not sure why yet." "Maybe that's all right. Maybe we don't need to know why right away." They settled in for the night, Martha on the platform with the good blankets, Caleb on the floor by the fire. He lay there listening to her breathing even out as she fell asleep. The fire crackled. Wind whispered around the shack's walls, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Caleb didn't feel entirely alone. The third day dawned clear and warmer. They made good time on the trail, which was gentler now, winding through high meadows where the grass was gold and the aspens were losing their leaves. Martha seemed more comfortable on the mule today, moving with the animal instead of fighting it. They talked more easily, too. Small things at first, favorite foods, books they'd read, memories of childhood, then deeper things. Martha told him about teaching herself to read, about the teacher who'd said girls didn't need education. Caleb told her about his father, a hard man who'd taught him that showing feeling was weakness, which was probably why he'd run so far when feelings had threatened to drown him. "Do you ever think about going back?" Martha asked. "To wherever you came from?" "Nothing to go back to. Family's all gone. The man I was then, he's gone too." "Maybe that man's still in there somewhere, just buried." "If he is, he can stay buried. I don't much like who I was before." By afternoon, the valley opened up below them. Caleb pointed to a thin line of smoke rising in the distance. "That's it. That's home." Martha stood in her stirrups, shading her eyes. "I can't see anything yet." "You will, another hour." That last hour felt both too fast and too slow. Caleb found himself wondering what Martha would think of the cabin. Would she see how much work he'd put into it over the years, or would she just see a lonely shack at the edge of nowhere? When they finally rounded the last bend and the cabin came into full view, Martha was quiet for a long moment. It sat in a small clearing, backed against a rock face with pines crowding close. The logs were weathered silver gray. The roof was solid. A covered porch ran along the front. Windows reflected the afternoon sun. "It's beautiful," Martha said softly. Caleb looked at it with fresh eyes, trying to see what she saw. To him, it was just the place he'd lived for 30 years. But maybe she saw what it had been when he'd first built it, when he'd still had hope for the future, when he'd thought Sarah and Emily would fill it with life and laughter. "It'll do," he said. They dismounted and Caleb unlocked the door. The interior smelled of wood smoke and leather, dust and time. One large room with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall, a kitchen area with a table and 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies. His bedroom door stood closed. The second bedroom, the one that had been Emily's before she'd ever had a chance to use it, was open and empty. Martha stood in the doorway, taking it all in. Caleb tried not to see it through her eyes. The starkness, the absence of any comfort or beauty. It was functional. That was all it had needed to be. "The second room's yours," he said, moving past her to start unloading supplies. "I'll bring in your trunk." She walked slowly to the bedroom door, looked inside. When she came back out, her expression was unreadable. "There's a rocking chair in there." Caleb's hands stilled on the bundle he was carrying. That was Sarah's. Should have gotten rid of it years ago. Never quite got around to it. "It's beautiful. The craftsmanship is remarkable. Her father made it, wedding present." He set down the bundle harder than necessary. "If you'd rather I moved it out?" "No." Martha's voice was firm. "Beautiful things shouldn't be destroyed because they hold pain. And I think," she paused, I think maybe it's time that chair got used again. Something in Caleb's chest loosened slightly. He nodded, not trusting his voice. They spent the rest of the afternoon unloading and settling in. Martha insisted on helping, despite her exhaustion from the journey. She organized her few belongings in the small bedroom, hung her dresses on pegs, arranged her books on a shelf Caleb had built years ago and never used. As evening approached, Caleb built a fire in the main room's fireplace. The cabin warmed quickly, the familiar crackle and smell of burning pine filling the space. Martha made coffee from their supplies and they sat at the table, the silence between them comfortable now. "Thank you," she said, "for all of this. One winter, that's the agreement. Still, you didn't have to. Neither did you. Could have taken your chances in town." Martha shook her head. "No, I couldn't have. Not really." She looked around the cabin. "This feels safer than anywhere I've been in a long time. It's quiet, takes some getting used to. I think I'm ready for quiet." As darkness fell, they settled into their separate rooms. Caleb lay in his narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of someone else in the cabin. Water being poured, floorboards creaking, the soft rustle of clothes being folded. It should have felt intrusive. Instead, it felt like the cabin was waking up after a long sleep. In the other room, Martha sat in Sarah's rocking chair, running her hands over the smooth wood. She pulled out Thomas's pocket watch, wound it carefully though it would never tick again, and held it in her lap. "I'm all right," she whispered to the dead husband she'd loved. "I'm going to be all right." The chair rocked gently, the fire crackled, and two lonely people, each haunted by their own ghosts, tried to figure out how to share the same space without falling apart. The first week passed in careful steps around each other, two people learning the boundaries of shared space. Caleb woke before dawn as he always had, built up the fire, put coffee on to boil. Martha rose soon after, moving quietly, trying not to intrude on his routines. They'd eat breakfast in near silence, then Caleb would head out to check his trap lines while Martha stayed at the cabin. She spent those early days organizing, cleaning, making the cabin more livable. Not that she said it needed cleaning, she was too polite for that, but Caleb noticed the difference. The dust gone from the shelves, the floor scrubbed clean, his scattered tools organized into sensible groupings. His kitchen, which had always been purely functional, suddenly had a logic to it that made cooking easier. "You moved my things," he said one evening, not quite accusing. "I did. Is that a problem?" He'd been about to say yes, but he reached for the salt, and it was exactly where his hand expected it to be. Closer than it had been before, more convenient. "No," he admitted. "It's actually better." "I thought it might be." She didn't smile, but he caught something in her expression that might have been satisfaction. By the second week, they'd fallen into a rhythm. Caleb still did his trapping and hunting, but now he returned to a cabin that smelled of bread baking or stew simmering. Martha had found his stores of flour and dried goods and was putting them to use. She was a better cook than he was, which wasn't saying much. He'd lived on game and hardtack for so long he'd forgotten food could have flavor. "This is good," he said one evening over a plate of venison stew that actually tasted like something. "It's just stew." "No, it's good stew. There's a difference." She did smile then, small but real. "Thank you." One afternoon he came back to find her in his kitchen, reorganizing his supplies. She'd discovered that mice had gotten into some of his stores over the summer and was sorting through the damage. "Half your flour is ruined," she said, not looking at him, "and the mice made a nest in your spare blankets. I'll set more traps." "You should have sealed these better." There was no criticism in her voice, just observation. "I can sew cloth bags that'll keep them out, if you have any spare fabric." "There might be some in Emily's trunk, the one in the storage corner." Martha went still. "Are you sure? I don't want to—" "It's just sitting there. Has been for 30 years. Might as well be useful." She found the trunk and opened it carefully, like it might contain something fragile. Which, Caleb supposed, it did. Memories, grief, all the things he'd packed away because looking at them hurt too much. Inside were baby clothes Sarah had sewn, tiny dresses Emily had never worn, fabric scraps, a partially finished quilt. Martha's hands moved gently over the contents. Your wife was talented." "She was." Caleb's voice came out rough. "She could make something beautiful out of nothing." "Would you mind—" Martha held up some of the fabric scraps. "If I use these, for the bags and maybe to mend this quilt, it seems a shame to leave it unfinished." He should have said no, should have told her to put it all back and leave it alone, but instead he heard himself say, "Go ahead, like you said, shame to leave things unfinished." Over the following days, he'd catch her sitting by the fire in the evenings, needle moving steadily through fabric. She was finishing Sarah's quilt, but she was also starting a new one. He watched her cut pieces from his old shirts, ones he hadn't worn in years, mixing them with pieces from her own clothes and from Emily's never-used dresses. "What is that?" he asked one night. "A quilt. For my bed. It gets cold at night." "Using my old clothes?" "You said I could use the fabric. And these shirts are worn through. No good for anything else." She held up a square. "But the fabric's still sound. Waste not, want not." It should have bothered him, seeing his past life cut up and sewn into something new, but watching Martha's capable hands working, creating something from pieces that had been forgotten, it felt right somehow, like those old clothes were getting a second chance at usefulness. The reading lessons started by accident. Caleb had been trying to decode a label on one of Henrik's supply packages and squinting at it in frustration. "What does this say?" he asked, handing it to Martha. "Dried apples, packed August 1884. She looked at him. "Can you not read it?" "Not well. Never had much schooling. Can work out simple words, but—" He shrugged, embarrassed. "I could teach you, if you'd like." His first instinct was to refuse. He'd managed 62 years without proper reading. But then he thought about all those books on Martha's shelf, all the knowledge they contained that was locked away from him. "All right." They started that evening. Martha was a patient teacher, starting with basics he'd never properly learned, how letters combined into sounds, how to break words into pieces that made sense. She used one of her books, reading passages aloud, then having him try. "You're doing well," she said after he'd struggled through a paragraph. "Better than you think." "I'm slow." "You're learning. That's what matters." He found himself looking forward to those evening lessons, partly because he was actually learning something, but mostly because of the way Martha's face changed when she was teaching, more animated, more present, like she'd found a purpose she'd been missing. They talked more during those evenings, about the books she loved, the stories that had sustained her through hard times, about why she'd married Thomas, what their life had been like. She didn't pretend it had been perfect. He was a good man, she said, but he was driven in a way that left no room for anything else. The farm was everything to him. I understood it, but I didn't always like it. "Sarah used to say I was too closed off," Caleb admitted. "Said I kept all my feelings locked up tight, wouldn't let anyone in." "Were you?" "Yeah, still am mostly." He paused. "But maybe not as much as I was." Martha looked at him across the firelight. "I'm glad." As November approached, the first real snow came. Not the light dusting they'd had on the trail, but a serious storm that dumped 2 feet in a single night. They woke to a world transformed, white and silent, and impossibly beautiful. Martha stood at the window, breath fogging the glass. "I've never seen so much snow. You'll see more before winter's done. Some years we get 10, 12 feet total. It piles up against the walls, covers the windows. You can dig tunnels through it." "How do you stand it? Being trapped here?" "You get used to it. Read a lot. Carve wood. Think too much." He came to stand beside her. "But this year I've got company. That'll help." She glanced at him, something shifting in her expression. "It helps me too. Being here. Having something to do. Someone to—" She stopped, seeming unsure how to finish. "Someone to what?" "Someone to talk to. Someone who understands what it's like to lose everything." That night, Caleb noticed that Martha had moved Sarah's rocking chair from her bedroom into the main room, positioning it near the fireplace. She sat in it while working on her quilt, the chair creaking softly with each rock. He should have felt something: anger, resentment, territorial possession. But what he felt instead was relief. The chair was being used. The cabin had someone in it who wasn't just surviving, but actually living. Maybe, he thought as he watched Martha's needle flash in the firelight, maybe that was what he'd been missing all these years. Not just another person, but a reason to do more than simply endure. December came with storms that lasted days, burying the cabin under drifts that reached the roofline. Caleb and Martha settled into the deep winter routine, keeping the fire fed, rationing supplies, making do with what they had. The world outside became abstract, just white and wind and cold. Inside, the cabin grew smaller and more intimate. Caleb's nightmares started in the second week of December. He'd managed to keep them at bay for years through sheer exhaustion and willful numbness. But something about Martha's presence in the cabin had opened doors he'd kept locked. He'd wake in the darkness, Sarah's name on his lips, the old grief as fresh as if 30 years were nothing. The first time it happened, he came out of his room to find Martha already up, kettle heating on the stove. "You were calling out," she said quietly. "I thought you might want some tea." He should have been embarrassed. Instead, he just sat at the table while she poured 2 cups. They didn't talk about it. Just sat together in the pre-dawn darkness, drinking tea and listening to the wind. After that, it became their unspoken arrangement. When he woke from nightmares, she'd be there. Sometimes with tea, sometimes just sitting by the fire. Her presence alone seemed to help, the knowledge that he wasn't entirely alone with his ghosts. One night, she told him about her own dreams. "I keep seeing Thomas falling in the field, over and over, and I'm running toward him, but I never get there in time." Does it help, talking about it? A little. Mostly it helps knowing someone else understands. The reading lessons progressed. Caleb could work through simple passages now, slowly but steadily. Martha praised each small victory, corrected his mistakes without making him feel stupid. He found himself wanting to please her, to show her his progress. "Listen," he said one evening, and read aloud a passage from one of her books. His pronunciation was careful, deliberate, but he made it through without stopping. "That was wonderful," Martha said, and her smile was genuine and warm. "I couldn't have done it without you." "You could have. You just needed someone to show you how." Christmas approached, and Martha suggested they mark the day somehow. Caleb resisted at first. He hadn't celebrated anything in 3 decades, but she was insistent, gentle, but firm. "We're alive," she said. "That's worth acknowledging." They kept it simple. Martha made a special meal from their supplies, venison roasted with herbs, bread fresh from the oven, dried apple pie sweetened with the last of their sugar. Caleb carved her a wooden spoon from pine, sanding it smooth, shaping the handle to fit her hand. She gave him a shirt she'd mended and altered from Thomas's old clothes, fitting it to Caleb's frame. They ate by firelight, neither admitting how much the day meant. After dinner, Martha asked Caleb to tell her about Christmas with Sarah and Emily. He found he could talk about it now without the grief choking him. Told her about Emily's excitement, how Sarah would make paper decorations, how simple and good those days had been. Martha listened, sometimes laughing, sometimes wiping her eyes. "They sound wonderful." They were, for a while. "Thomas and I always said we'd have a big Christmas when we had children." Martha's voice was wistful. "We never got the chance." "I'm sorry." "Me too, but maybe..." She looked around the cabin. "Maybe this is all right too. Different, but all right." That night, sitting close by the fire, their shoulders touched. Neither moved away. The contact was warm, comforting, charged with something neither was quite ready to name. As January deepened, Caleb noticed their supplies running lower than he'd like. The winter had been harder than usual, keeping him from hunting as much as he needed. They weren't in danger yet, but he'd feel better with more meat stored. "I need to make a hunting trip," he told Martha one morning. 3, maybe 4 days. There's a valley about 15 miles north. Elk winter there. I can get enough meat to see us through to spring." Martha's face went carefully blank. "Of course. You should go." "You'll be all right here? You know how to keep the fire going, ration the wood." "I'll be fine. I'm not helpless." But he saw the fear in her eyes, the thought of being alone in the wilderness, snowbound, no one for miles. He understood it. He'd feel the same in her position. "I could wait," he offered. "Try closer to home." "No. If you need to go, you should go. I'll manage." He left early the next morning, his pack heavy with supplies, his rifle over his shoulder. Martha stood in the doorway watching him trudge through the snow. He looked back once and saw her still standing there, small and alone against the vast white landscape. The hunting was good. He found the elk herd and brought down a young bull on the second day. Spent the third day processing the meat, smoking strips over a fire to preserve them. But the whole time, his mind kept drifting back to the cabin. Was Martha all right? Was the fire still going? Had the weather held? He started back on the fourth morning, pushing harder than was wise, half running through the snow. Something urgent drove him forward, a need to get back that he didn't fully understand. The cabin came into view just before dusk. Smoke rose from the chimney. Everything looked normal, but Caleb didn't slow until he was at the door. It swung open before he could knock. Martha stood there, her face flooding with relief. "You're back." "Said I would be." "I know, but—" She stopped, seemed to struggle with something. "I'm glad you're back." She helped him unload the meat, exclaimed over the amount he'd brought. They worked together in comfortable silence, storing everything properly. But Caleb could feel something had shifted. The way she stayed close, the way her hand brushed his more often than necessary, the way her eyes kept finding his. That evening, sitting by the fire, Martha spoke what was becoming undeniable. "I was afraid you wouldn't come back, that something would happen, or you'd decide you were better off alone, or—" She stopped. "I realized while you were gone how much I've come to depend on this. On you. On having someone who understands." Caleb's throat tightened. "I was afraid too. The whole time all I could think about was getting back. Making sure you were all right." He paused. "Making sure we were all right." "What does that mean?" "We?" He didn't have a good answer. All he knew was that somewhere over the past months, they'd stopped being two separate people sharing a space and had become something more. Something he didn't have words for yet. "It means I don't want to be alone anymore," he said finally, "and I don't think you do either." Martha's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "No, I don't." She reached for his hand. He took it, marveling at the warmth, the rightness of it. They sat like that until the fire burned low, hands clasped, neither speaking because there were no words for what was growing between them. Outside, the wind howled and the snow fell. Inside, two people who'd thought they were done with feeling anything began to hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd been wrong. The quilt Martha was making had grown larger, more complex, pieces of both their lives woven together into something new, a pattern emerging from scraps that had seemed useless on their own, but together created something whole and beautiful. Like them, Caleb thought, two broken pieces learning how to fit together. "Tell me about the stars," Martha said as they prepared for bed that night. "The ones you can see from here. I want to learn their names." "We've got all winter," Caleb said. "We'll learn them together." It felt like a promise, like an acknowledgement that winter wasn't an ending but a beginning, that when spring came, maybe neither of them would be ready to say goodbye. Late February brought a brief thaw, the kind that tricks you into thinking spring might come early. The snow softened, the icicles dripped, and for a few days the world felt less like it was trying to kill you. Caleb took advantage of the weather to check his trap lines and bring in more firewood. Martha aired out the cabin, hung blankets in the sun, baked bread with the windows cracked to let in fresh air. They were sitting down to supper when they heard it, the distant sound of snowshoes crunching through crust. Caleb's hand went to his rifle before his mind fully registered the sound. Up here, unexpected visitors were never good news. "Stay inside," he told Martha, moving to the door. But she followed him to the window, looking out at the two figures emerging from the tree line. Even at a distance, Caleb recognized the first one's silhouette. "That's Sheriff Clayton." "What's he doing here?" "Nothing good." Caleb opened the door as the men reached the porch. Clayton looked exhausted, his face wind-burned, ice in his beard. The man with him was younger, dressed too fine for the wilderness. City clothes under a heavy coat, leather satchel clutched tight. "Caleb, Mrs. Hale," Clayton's voice was grim. "We need to talk." "Come in, you look half frozen." They crowded into the cabin. Martha immediately put coffee on to heat while Caleb helped the men out of their heavy coats. The younger man introduced himself as William Garrett, legal representative from Copper Ridge. "This must be important," Caleb said, "to bring you all the way up here in winter." "It is." Clayton accepted the coffee Martha offered, wrapped his hands around the cup. "And I'm sorry to bring it. You folks have been through enough." Garrett pulled documents from his satchel, Mrs. Hale, Mr. Ward, I'm afraid there's been a legal challenge to the debt settlement that took place last October. Martha went very still. Caleb felt something cold settle in his stomach. What kind of challenge? Banker Crowley has filed a motion with the territorial court. He's claiming the debt settlement was invalid. Garrett spread papers on the table. His argument is that Mrs. Hale, as the surviving spouse, had legal rights that weren't properly observed during the settlement. Specifically, that she was under duress and did not give verbal consent to the transaction at the time it occurred. That's horseshit, Caleb said. The debts were paid in full. I was there. Judge Harlan verified it. I know. Clayton's face was pained. And Judge Harlan is fighting this. But Crowley's got lawyers from the territorial capital. They're arguing that because Martha was in a vulnerable state, grieving, financially desperate, any transaction involving her late husband's debts required her explicit, documented consent. Martha found her voice. But I was free. The judge said I was free. You were. You are. Garrett's tone was apologetic. But Crowley is claiming that the debt settlement only addressed the monetary debts, not the property claims. He says Thomas Hale's farm, the land itself, still has liens against it that weren't properly settled. I don't understand. Martha's hands were shaking. What does this mean? Garrett shifted uncomfortably. It means Crowley is demanding you return to Copper Ridge to appear before the territorial judge. He's claiming you owe... He consulted his papers. An additional $42 in property taxes and fees that weren't included in the original settlement. That's convenient, Caleb said darkly. Why didn't these fees exist back in October? They did, Clayton said, but Crowley's argument is that they weren't part of the debt auction. They're separate assessments tied directly to the land. Martha was very pale. What happens if I can't pay? Garrett looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Then the court could rule that you're still liable for the debt, which would mean she'd have to sign over the land, Clayton finished. That's what this is really about. Crowley wants that farm. Word is the railroad's interested in the route through that valley. Land values are about to jump. So he waited, Caleb said. Let us think it was over. Let us get comfortable. Then sprung this. That about sums it up. Clayton's face was tight with anger. It's legal, technically. Barely, but it's dirty as hell. Martha stood abruptly, walked to the window. Her shoulders were rigid, her hands clenched. Caleb wanted to go to her, but wasn't sure if she wanted to be touched right now. When? She asked, without turning. When do I have to appear? Court date is set for March 15th, Garrett said. 2 weeks from today. If you don't appear, Crowley can file for a default judgment. You'd lose automatically. And if I do appear, then you can present your case. We can argue that the original settlement was complete and binding, that these additional fees are fraudulent. But, Garrett paused, but you should know that Crowley has significant influence. The territorial judge, while fair, is also practical. And Crowley holds debts for half the businesses in the valley. The implication was clear. Justice might not be as blind as it ought to be. Martha turned from the window. Her face was composed, but Caleb could see the cracks forming. I don't have $42. I don't have anything. We'll figure it out, Caleb said. There has to be a way. There is a way. Clayton spoke quietly. Crowley made it clear. If Martha signs over the deed to the farm, he'll forgive all debts, past and present. Clean slate. No. Martha's voice was sharp. That farm was Thomas's dream. He worked himself to death for it. I won't just hand it over to that vulture. Then we fight, Caleb said. Garrett looked between them. Mr. Ward, I appreciate your support, but you should understand the reality. Crowley has expensive lawyers. He has connections. And frankly, the law is somewhat on his side. These property assessments, while suspiciously timed, aren't technically illegal. So what do you suggest? Come to town, present your case, but be prepared for the possibility that you might lose. Garrett began gathering his papers. I'm sorry I don't have better news. Clayton stood, preparing to leave. I argued against making this trip in winter, told them it could wait until spring, but Crowley insisted the court date couldn't be moved. He put a hand on Caleb's shoulder. Watch your backs, both of you. Crowley's not the type to play fair. After they left, the cabin felt colder despite the fire. Martha stood by the window, arms wrapped around herself. Caleb didn't know what to say. Everything they'd built over the winter, the fragile peace, the growing closeness, felt like it was crumbling. "I should never have come here," Martha said softly. "I've brought nothing but trouble." "That's not true. Isn't it? You gave up everything to help me, and now you're being dragged into this legal mess. You should have left me in that town square." Caleb crossed the room, turned her to face him. "Listen to me. What happened in that square? That wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about you, not really. It was about me finally giving a damn about something again after 30 years of not caring. But now we deal with it. Together." He gripped her shoulders gently. "You said you wouldn't sign over Thomas's land. Well, I won't let them force you to. We'll go to town. We'll fight this." "With what? We don't have money for lawyers. We don't have evidence that these fees are fraudulent. We have nothing." "We have the truth, and we have each other." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "Is that enough?" "I don't know, but it's what we've got." She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her while she shook with silent tears. All the strength she'd shown over the winter finally cracking under the weight of this fresh injustice. "I can't lose you," she whispered. "I can't go back to being alone." "You won't, I promise." That night, neither of them slept. They sat by the fire, Martha wrapped in the quilt she'd made from pieces of their pasts, Caleb with his arm around her. The future they'd begun to imagine together suddenly felt fragile and threatened. "Tell me about the stars," Martha said quietly, "the ones you were going to teach me." So Caleb talked, pointing out constellations through the window, making up stories when he didn't know the real ones, trying to give her something stable to hold on to when everything else felt like it was falling apart. As dawn broke cold and gray, they made their decision. They would go to Copper Ridge, they would face whatever Crowley had planned, and they would do it together. But first, they needed to prepare, because if Caleb knew anything about men like Crowley, it was that they didn't stop at legal challenges. They'd use every weapon they had, fair or foul, and Caleb intended to be ready. The days before their departure felt both too long and too short. Caleb prepared for the journey with the thoroughness of a man who'd learned that carelessness in the mountains could kill you. He checked their supplies, repaired snowshoes, packed food and blankets. Martha watched him work with increasing anxiety. "What if something happens on the way down?" she asked. "What if we get caught in a storm? Then we wait it out. We've got supplies for that." He didn't mention that early March storms could be the worst, unpredictable, violent, capable of dropping 6 feet of snow in a day. She knew it anyway. She'd lived through enough winter now to understand. On the third day of preparation, Martha began going through the trunk of possessions she'd brought from town. Most of it was clothes and a few mementos, things she'd already unpacked and organized, but at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was something she'd forgotten. "Caleb!" Her voice was odd, strained. "Come look at this." He found her kneeling by the trunk, holding a leather-bound book. Not one of her reading books. This was something else, worn and water-stained, filled with cramped handwriting. Thomas's ledger, his account book from the farm. She flipped through pages. "I forgot I'd packed this. Thought I might need it for..." She stopped, staring at a page. Oh no. "What is it?" She handed him the book, pointing to a column of numbers. "Look, these are payments Thomas made to the bank, every month for 3 years. But when Crowley presented the debt at the auction, he claimed Thomas hadn't made payments in over a year." Caleb studied the entries. Thomas Hale had terrible handwriting, but good record-keeping. Each payment was noted with a date, amount, and in many cases, witness signatures. "Who's this?" He pointed to a signature that appeared repeatedly. "Old Henrik. He witnessed several of the payments. Thomas would pay at the bank, then stop by the trading post to have Henrik verify the transaction in his ledger. Said it was the only way he trusted the numbers. Because he didn't trust Crowley." Thomas never said that outright, but he was careful. Very careful. She flipped to another section. "And look here. These are assessments for property taxes. He paid them. Every year. On time." The implications were staggering. If Thomas had been making payments that Crowley hadn't recorded, if he'd paid taxes that were now being claimed as outstanding, this wasn't just aggressive debt collection. This was fraud. "This is it," Caleb said. "This is how we fight him." Martha's hands were shaking as she turned pages. But will anyone believe this? Crowley will just say Thomas forged the entries, that the ledger's not reliable. Henrik's signature is on half these pages. Henrik's a respected businessman. If he testifies that he witnessed these payments, if he's willing to testify against Crowley, Martha's voice was tight. Crowley holds the note on Henrik's trading post. If Henrik crosses him, then we find others. We get the church records. Your reverence said Thomas made donations, right? That proves he had money Crowley claimed didn't exist. We get every scrap of evidence we can. Caleb felt something fierce rising in his chest. We show everyone exactly what kind of man Crowley is. They spent the next 2 days going through every page of the ledger, making notes, cross-referencing dates. Martha had a memory for details that amazed Caleb. She remembered conversations with Thomas about specific payments, could recall exact amounts and dates. Together they built a timeline that showed systematic manipulation of the books. He was stealing from us, Martha said quietly. All those years Thomas worked himself to death and Crowley was stealing from us. From a lot of people, probably. Men like that don't stop at one victim. Then we expose him, for Thomas, for everyone he's hurt. The night before they were to leave, Caleb found Martha sitting by the fire, Thomas's pocket watch in her hands. She wasn't winding it as she usually did, just holding it, staring at the stopped hands. I'm scared, she admitted. Not of losing the land. I'm scared of losing this. She gestured around the cabin. Losing what we have here. What if we go back to town and everything changes? Caleb sat beside her. Everything's already changed. The moment Clayton walked through that door, our quiet winter ended. I know, but I wish... She stopped, wiped her eyes. I wish we had more time. Just us, before the world came crashing back in. He understood. These months in the cabin had been a respite from grief, from loneliness, from the harsh realities that had driven them both into isolation. Going back meant facing all of it again. Judgment, complications, the messiness of other people's opinions and agendas. When this is over, he said carefully, when we've dealt with Crowley and the court and all the rest, what do you want? Martha looked at him. The firelight caught the silver in her hair, the lines around her eyes that came from years of squinting into sun and wind. She was beautiful in a way he'd stopped noticing in women, the beauty of someone who'd survived hard things and come out stronger. I want to come back here, she said. If you'll have me, not as a temporary guest, not as someone just waiting out the winter, but as... She hesitated. As what? As someone who belongs here, with you. Caleb's throat tightened. You already belong here. Have for a while now. Do I? Or am I just convenient company? Someone to keep the loneliness at bay until spring comes and you remember you prefer solitude? No. He took her hand, laced their fingers together. You're not convenient. You're... He struggled for words. He'd spent 30 years not talking about feelings, and now when he needed them most, the words wouldn't come. Martha saved him. I love you. I didn't mean to. I came here thinking I'd just survive the winter and move on, but somewhere between the reading lessons and the nightmares and the quilt making, I fell in love with you. And I'm terrified that when we go back to town, you'll realize you don't feel the same. I do feel the same. The words came out rough but honest. I love you. Don't know when it happened exactly. Maybe in the town square when you stood there with such dignity. Maybe when you finished Sarah's quilt and didn't make a big thing of it. Maybe it was gradual, piece by piece, like that quilt you're making. He squeezed her hand. But I love you, and I want you here, not for a season, for all the seasons. She was crying now, but smiling too. Even though I reorganize your kitchen and use up your fabric scraps? Especially because of that. They sat close, foreheads touching, breathing the same air. Outside, the wind was picking up, another storm coming, most likely. But inside, something had been said that couldn't be unsaid, a promise made, even if it wasn't spoken in those exact words. We should get married, Martha said suddenly. After the trial, if we win, we should make it official. You want to marry an old mountain hermit? I want to marry you. The mountain hermit thing is just a bonus. Caleb laughed, surprising himself. He couldn't remember the last time he'd genuinely laughed. All right then, after we win. We'll have Reverend Matthews do his thing. And if we don't win, we will. He made it sound certain, even though nothing was. And then we come back here, build a life, together. Morning came too soon. They packed in silence, both feeling the weight of what lay ahead. The journey down would take 3 days if the weather held, maybe longer if it didn't. And then the trial, the confrontation with Crowley, the judgment that would determine whether Martha kept her late husband's legacy or lost everything. As they prepared to leave, Martha took one last look around the cabin. The fire was banked, the windows shuttered, everything secured against their absence. It looked cold and empty, like it had for 30 years before she'd arrived. "It'll be here when we get back," Caleb said. "Promise?" "I promise. This is home now, for both of us." They started down the mountain as a late winter storm began to gather in the north. The wind carried the scent of snow, and the sky had that peculiar quality that meant heavy weather was coming. But they pushed on, committed now to whatever waited at the bottom. Martha had the ledger wrapped carefully in oilcloth and tucked in her pack. Their evidence, their ammunition against a man who thought money and influence could crush anyone who stood against him. "What if Henrik won't testify?" Martha asked as they made their way down the trail. "Then we find someone who will. There has to be others who've been cheated by Crowley. We just have to find them." "And if we can't?" Caleb stopped, turned to face her. "Then we fight anyway, with what we have, because the alternative is letting him win. And I didn't spend 30 years alone in these mountains learning how to survive just to roll over for a banker with delusions of power." Martha smiled despite her fear. "You're stubborn." "So are you. It's one of the things I love about you." They continued down the trail. Behind them, the cabin waited in the snow. Ahead, in the town of Copper Ridge, a banker who'd grown accustomed to getting his way was about to learn that some people didn't break as easily as he thought. The storm was coming, both the weather and the confrontation that waited at journey's end. But Caleb and Martha walked into it together, hand in hand when the trail allowed, and that made all the difference. The courthouse in Copper Ridge was packed. Word had spread about the trial, and it seemed half the territory had turned out to watch. Some came out of genuine concern for Martha. Most came for the spectacle. Wealthy banker versus widow and mountain man. It was better entertainment than anything else on offer. Caleb and Martha sat at the defendant's table, their lawyer, a young man named Carson, who'd agreed to represent them for a modest fee, shuffling papers nervously. Across the aisle, Crowley sat with 2 lawyers in expensive suits, their faces arranged in confident smirks. Judge Harlan entered, and the room fell silent. The old judge looked tired but determined, his eyes scanning the crowd before settling on the parties before him. "This court is now in session. We're here to address the matter of outstanding debts and property liens related to the estate of Thomas Hale, deceased, and the claims brought by Copper Ridge Bank and Trust." He looked at Crowley's lead lawyer. "Mr. Blackstone, you may present your case." Blackstone stood, smooth and polished. "Thank you, Your Honor. This is a simple matter of law and proper procedure. The debt settlement that occurred last October, while generous in spirit, failed to address certain critical elements. He laid out Crowley's argument with practiced ease. The property taxes that supposedly weren't paid, the fees that weren't included in the auction, the technicalities that Martha's consent hadn't been properly documented. He made it sound reasonable, made it sound like Crowley was simply following the law, protecting the bank's legitimate interests. Caleb felt his jaw clench as Blackstone spun the narrative. "Furthermore," Blackstone continued, "we must question the circumstances of that original settlement. Mr. Ward here," he gestured dismissively at Caleb, "a stranger with no connection to Mrs. Hale, suddenly appears and pays her debts with his entire winter's earnings. One must ask, what was his motivation? What did he expect in return?" "Objection." Carson was on his feet. "Mr. Ward's motivations are not on trial here." Overruled. Judge Harlan's voice was grave. "Mr. Blackstone, get to your point." "My point, Your Honor, is that Mrs. Hale entered into a highly irregular arrangement immediately following this transaction. She left town with a strange man, lived in isolation with him for months. This raises questions about her judgment, her state of mind, and whether she was truly capable of making informed decisions about her late husband's estate." Martha's face had gone pale. Caleb reached under the table and squeezed her hand. The character assassination had begun, just as they'd feared. Blackstone called his first witness, a clerk from the bank who testified about the supposedly missing tax payments. The man had neat handwriting and a nervous manner, reading from bank records that showed no payments received from Thomas Hale for the past 18 months. Carson cross-examined, but the clerk stuck to his story. The records showed what they showed. Next came a surveyor who testified about the value of the Hale farm property. Prime agricultural land, he said, well positioned for development. The railroad's interested in a route through that valley. Property values in the area have increased substantially. That's what this was really about, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. But knowing it and proving it were different things. During a brief recess, old Henrik found Caleb outside the courthouse. "I want to testify," the old man said. "I witnessed those payments. My signature's in that ledger." "Crowley holds your loan." "I know, but this isn't right. Thomas was a good man, and Martha doesn't deserve this." Henrik's weathered face was set with determination. "Let me help." When court resumed, Blackstone called more witnesses, a land assessor, a tax collector, each one building the case that Martha owed money she couldn't pay. Then he dropped his final bombshell. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Mrs. Martha Hale to the stand." Martha's hand tightened on Caleb's. This was the moment they dreaded. She stood slowly, walked to the witness stand, and was sworn in. Blackstone circled her like a predator. "Mrs. Hale, when you left Copper Ridge last October, where did you go?" "To Mr. Ward's cabin in the high country." "And you lived there with him, alone, just the two of you?" "Yes." "Were you married?" "No." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Blackstone let it build before continuing. "So you lived, unmarried, in isolation with a man you'd just met, a man who'd paid a considerable sum for, well, how would you characterize the transaction?" "He paid my debts. He gave me my freedom." "Did he?" Blackstone's voice dripped skepticism. "Or did he simply transfer your obligation from the bank to himself? Tell me, Mrs. Hale, what services did you provide in exchange for room and board these past months?" "Objection!" Carson was on his feet again. "Your Honor, this is outrageous." "I'll rephrase," Blackstone said smoothly. "Mrs. Hale, during your time in Mr. Ward's cabin, did you perform domestic labor? Cooking, cleaning, mending?" "Yes." "So, in essence, you worked for Mr. Ward in exchange for shelter, which is exactly what would have happened had the labor contract proceeded as originally planned. The only difference is that Mr. Ward's terms were, shall we say, less formally documented." Martha's face flushed. It wasn't like that. "Then how was it, Mrs. Hale? You, a vulnerable widow, him, a recluse who'd lived alone for 30 years, what exactly was the nature of your arrangement?" Caleb half rose from his chair, fury burning through him. Carson grabbed his arm, pulling him back down. Causing a scene now would only make things worse. "We helped each other," Martha said quietly. "He gave me a place to heal. I gave him—" She stopped, her voice breaking. "Yes?" Blackstone pressed. "What did you give him?" "Company, someone to talk to, a reason to care about something again." Tears were streaming down her face now, but her voice was steady. "And he gave me the same. He saved my life that day in the square, and he's been saving it every day since." The courtroom was silent. For a moment, even Blackstone seemed at a loss for words. Blackstone recovered quickly. "Your Honor, I believe we've established the questionable nature of this arrangement. I move that—" "Your Honor." Carson was standing, his voice stronger than before. "The defense would like to present evidence." Judge Harlan nodded. "Proceed." Carson approached the bench with Thomas's ledger. "This is the personal account book of Thomas Hale, maintained meticulously over 3 years until his death. I'd like to submit it as evidence and call our first witness to authenticate it." Old Henrik took the stand. His hands shook slightly as he was sworn in, but his voice was steady. "Mr. Henrik," Carson began, "how long have you known the Hale family?" "Known Thomas since he first came to the valley. Good man, honest, worked hard." "Did Thomas Hale conduct business at your trading post?" "Regularly, every month, sometimes more." Carson opened the ledger to a marked page. "Do you recognize this signature?" Henrik squinted at it. "That's mine. I witnessed that payment." "Can you tell the court what this entry records?" "Thomas paid $35 to the bank, January 1883. He came to my store afterward. Had me sign the ledger as witness. Said Crowley sometimes forgot to record payments properly. Henrik's eyes found Crowley across the courtroom. Said he wanted proof. How many times did you witness these payments, Mr. Henrik? 12 times at least, maybe more. Carson flipped through pages, having Henrik identify his signature again and again. With each identification, the evidence mounted. Thomas had been making regular payments that somehow weren't in the bank's official records. Mr. Henrik, Carson asked, do you know why Thomas would have wanted witnesses to his payments? Objection, Blackstone called. Speculation. I'll allow it, Judge Harlan said. Henrik cleared his throat. Thomas told me once that Crowley's bank had done the same thing to his neighbor, claimed payments weren't made when they were. Neighbor lost his land. Thomas was determined that wouldn't happen to him. The old man's voice grew firmer. So he kept careful records, and he was right to do it. Blackstone's cross-examination was vicious. Mr. Henrik, isn't it true that the bank holds the loan on your trading post? It is. And isn't it also true that if you anger Mr. Crowley, he could call that loan due immediately? He could. Yet you're willing to testify against his interests? Why? What has Mrs. Hale offered you in exchange for this testimony? Henrik's weathered face set in hard lines. Nobody's offered me nothing. I'm testifying because it's the truth. And because I'm old enough that I don't much care what Crowley does to me. Some things matter more than money. The murmur from the crowd was supportive this time. Blackstone pressed harder, but Henrik wouldn't budge from his testimony. The old trader had clearly decided that integrity mattered more than financial security, and nothing the lawyer said would shake him. Carson called Reverend Matthews next. The Reverend produced church records showing charitable donations Thomas had made. Donations that proved he'd had money during the same periods Crowley claimed he'd been delinquent. These donations were recorded in our official church ledger, Matthews explained. Thomas was a generous man even when times were hard. He gave what he could to help others in need. The pattern was becoming clear. Thomas Hale had been a man who paid his bills, supported his church, and kept meticulous records. The only place where payments mysteriously went missing was at Crowley's bank. Finally, Carson called Martha back to the stand. Her eyes were still red from crying, but she'd composed herself. Mrs. Hale, I have one question. You've heard testimony that your husband made regular payments to the bank, payments that somehow weren't recorded. Did your husband ever express concern about the bank's bookkeeping? Yes, constantly. He said Crowley's clerks made convenient mistakes that always benefited the bank. Martha's voice was steady now. That's why he kept his own records. That's why he had witnesses. He knew what Crowley was. And the property taxes that Crowley claims are outstanding? Thomas paid them, every year, on time. He was terrified of losing the land. It was everything to him. He would never have let those payments lapse. Carson returned to his table and picked up one final document. Your Honor, I'd like to submit this notarized statement from the Territorial Tax Office. It confirms that property taxes on the Hale farm were paid in full through 1884. There are no outstanding assessments. The courtroom erupted. Crowley was on his feet, his face purple with rage. Judge Harlan's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Order! I will have order! The room fell silent. Harlan looked at the documents before him, then at Crowley, then back to the papers. His expression was grave. Mr. Crowley, it appears there are significant discrepancies between your bank's records and multiple other sources. This court finds the testimony and documentation presented by the defense to be credible and compelling. Crowley's lawyer started to object, but Harlan cut him off. Furthermore, this court finds that the original debt settlement conducted last October was valid and complete. Mrs. Martha Hale's debts were paid in full. She owes nothing to Copper Ridge Bank and Trust. He paused, letting that sink in. Additionally, the property deed to the Hale farm remains in Mrs. Hale's name. She is free to dispose of it as she sees fit. Martha's hand found Caleb's under the table, squeezing tight. However, Harlan continued, his voice taking on an edge of steel, I am deeply troubled by the pattern of irregularities in the bank's record-keeping. I am ordering a full audit of Copper Ridge Bank and Trust to be conducted by territorial authorities. If systematic fraud is uncovered, appropriate charges will be filed. Crowley was ashen now. The crowd was buzzing with excitement. Harlan's gavel fell one final time. "This case is dismissed. Mrs. Hale, you're free to go." The courthouse erupted in cheers and applause. Martha was crying again, but this time from relief and joy. Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding her tight while the celebration swirled around them. They'd won, not just the case, but something bigger. They'd stood up to power and corruption and won, together. The week after the trial passed in a blur of activity and emotion. News of Judge Harlan's ruling spread through the territory like wildfire. The audit he'd ordered turned up exactly what everyone suspected: years of manipulated records, missing payments, and fraudulent assessments. Crowley's bank was seized by territorial authorities, and the banker himself faced criminal charges. His empire of carefully constructed lies had collapsed in a matter of days. Martha and Caleb stayed at the boarding house while she dealt with the practical matters of her victory. The farm, still legally hers, drew immediate interest. Several families wanted to buy it. Good people who'd work the land with respect and care, the kind of stewards Thomas would have approved of. In the end, she sold it to a young couple with 3 small children. The husband reminded her of Thomas, earnest, hardworking, full of hope. The wife was quiet and capable, the kind of woman who could turn a house into a home. "You'll be happy here," Martha told them as she signed the deed over. "It's good land. It just needs people who'll love it." The sale brought enough money to secure their future. Supplies for the cabin, funds set aside for emergencies, enough to give them options they'd never had before. But what mattered most to Martha wasn't the money. It was the closure, the final letting go of a life that was over, so she could fully embrace the one waiting ahead. Old Henrik threw a celebration at the trading post the night before they were set to leave. It wasn't much. Coffee and pie, some fiddle music, people who wanted to shake their hands and tell them they'd done a brave thing. Sheriff Clayton was there, along with Judge Harlan. Even Reverend Matthews showed up, looking slightly embarrassed about his previous suggestions. "About that marriage offer," he said to Martha and Caleb. "If you're still interested—" "We are," Martha said, before Caleb could respond. "Very interested." The ceremony took place in the small church the next morning. No fancy clothes or elaborate decorations, just Martha in her best dress, Caleb in a borrowed suit that almost fit, and a handful of friends who'd stood by them when it mattered. Old Henrik gave Martha away. Sheriff Clayton signed as witness, and Reverend Matthews spoke words about love and partnership that actually seemed to mean something this time. "I, Martha, take you, Caleb." Her voice was clear and certain. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until we are parted by death." Caleb repeated the words, meaning every one of them. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them married, Caleb kissed his wife with a tenderness that surprised him. He'd thought those feelings were dead in him. Turned out they'd just been sleeping, waiting for the right person to wake them up. They left Copper Ridge the next morning, Mr. and Mrs. Ward now, heading back to the mountains. The journey felt different this time. The weight of uncertainty was gone. They weren't running from anything or hiding. They were going home. The spring thaw was in full force. The trail was muddy and difficult, streams swollen with snowmelt. But the world was coming alive again, birds singing, wildflowers pushing through the last of the snow, the air warm and full of promise. They took their time, camping beside streams, talking late into the night about plans for the cabin. They'd expand it, Martha said. Add a proper kitchen, maybe build a root cellar, plant a garden come summer. "We could get chickens," she suggested. "I miss having fresh eggs." "Chickens," Caleb repeated like it was a foreign word. Then he smiled. "Sure, why not? Maybe a milk cow too, if we can manage it." "Look at you planning ahead. 6 months ago you told me you never thought past the next season." 6 months ago, I didn't have a reason to. He reached for her hand. Now I'm thinking years ahead, decades, if we're lucky. When the cabin finally came into view, Martha stopped on the trail to look at it. Their home. Not just shelter or a place to survive the winter, but an actual home where they'd build a life together. "It looks smaller than I remember," she said. "We'll make it bigger, together." They unpacked slowly, taking their time to settle back in. The cabin had weathered their absence well. A little cold, a little dusty, but fundamentally sound. Martha built up the fire while Caleb brought in supplies from their packs. That evening, They sat on the porch, or rather, on the ground where the porch would eventually be built. The sun was setting behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The valley below was coming alive with spring, patches of green emerging from the melting snow. "Tell me about the stars," Martha said, leaning against Caleb's shoulder. "You promised to teach me their names." Caleb looked up at the emerging constellations. "That one there is Ursa Major, the Great Bear, and that bright one is Polaris, the North Star. Sailors use it for navigation. And that one?" She pointed to a cluster of stars. "The Pleiades. 7 sisters, according to the old stories. They were so beautiful that Zeus placed them in the sky to protect them." "Tell me the story." So he did, making up details when he didn't know them, embellishing others because it made her smile. They sat there as darkness fell completely, naming stars and inventing stories, planning their future in between. "We should build that porch first," Martha decided. "Proper chairs for star watching. And the garden plot. You'll want to get seeds in the ground soon. And a chicken coop. Don't forget the chickens." "How could I forget the chickens?" They were quiet for a moment, just breathing in the cool mountain air, feeling the peace of being exactly where they belonged. "Caleb," Martha's voice was soft. "Thank you for that day in the town square, for seeing me when everyone else looked away, for giving me a reason to want to live again." "You did the same for me." He kissed the top of her head. "We saved each other." "I suppose we did." The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and unchanging. The mountains stood silent, witness to yet another chapter in their long history. And in a small cabin at the edge of the wilderness, 2 people who'd thought they were finished with life discovered they were really just beginning. The fire crackled. The night sounds of the forest rose around them, wind in the pines, an owl calling in the distance, the creek's constant murmur. Martha's quilt lay across their shoulders, pieces of their past woven into something new and whole. "Tell me more about the stars," Martha said. "We have all the time in the world." And they did, years ahead of shared mornings and quiet evenings, laughter and occasional tears, the simple joy of not being alone, a life built from the scraps of what came before, made beautiful by the hands that shaped it. Caleb pointed to another constellation. "That one's called Cassiopeia, the Queen. See how it forms a W shape?" "I see it. It's beautiful." "You're beautiful." Martha smiled and settled closer against him. The cabin door stood open behind them, firelight spilling out into the darkness. A home, finally, for both of them. And somewhere in heaven or memory or wherever the dead go, Sarah and Thomas looked down and smiled. Because the people they'd loved had found a way forward, had found each other, had chosen life over mere survival. The stars burned bright, the mountains stood eternal, and 2 lonely souls, no longer lonely, began the rest of their lives together.